Tonight's big story, a new study on sea level rise is highlighting another threat to towns and cities across New Zealand. It won't just be waves crashing into homes, but an attack from underground, with water washing out drains and roads. Petone on Wellington's harbour is a grim case study into the effect of sea level rise. The settlement is sinking.
It's incredibly vulnerable to changes in sea level. We only have 20 years, maybe less.
For many areas, the global average rise of 30 centimetres by 2060 is coming in only 10 or 20 years. In fact, in some places around Aotearoa, it's happening at double and even triple the global rate. In Petone, a 30 centimetre sea level rise is enough to incapacitate the town's gravity-powered stormwater system.
We've moved from central Petone to up on the Western Hills.
I'm not worried. I've been in Wellington, my whole life, and I haven't seen these sea levels rise.
Wellington Regional Council says the price tag for durable drainage and roading could run into the hundreds of millions.
But it may well be the case that we simply cannot afford to protect everywhere.
Another option is not better pipes, but ponds. So-called sponge cities have been successful in Europe and China.
Low-lying areas like some of the big parks, which would have been concreted in the past, have been opened up for vegetation, and so the ground becomes the sponge.
Because as long as we keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, pumping water out of our homes and cities will get even harder. OK, well, what can we do to safeguard our homes? Joining me live now is Sustainable Cities expert, Dr. Crystal Olin. Thanks so much for coming on, Crystal. Right, we need some big ideas to tackle this, don't we? Where do we start?
Kia ora, thanks for having me. Look, I think when it comes to managing this issue, cities really have three big choices in a way. Protect the coastline with seawalls and flood defences, for example, although there are softer approaches, more nature-friendly approaches to that as well. Reduce the impact of coastal flooding with upgrading and adapting buildings and infrastructure, so potentially raising roads, looking at that underground infrastructure and the critical things that need to happen there around pumps or flex valves to mitigate that gravity concern. Retreat from at-risk areas that we really can't stay in. But I'd argue a really important place to start with any of those options, or perhaps its own option in and of itself, is a shift in mindset and really thinking about getting back to nature and letting nature come back into our cities. So learning from nature rather than fearing from her.
So how would that work then?
Well, there's an opportunity now, right? We can think about how we might be able to reconnect people with the water. So rather than sort of hard seawalls, for example, could we put in berms or living levees, marshlands, salt ponds, things like that. So perhaps this sponge city, as some call it, so really thinking about that green infrastructure. And that can have really amazing co-benefits as well. So prioritizing putting in green public spaces, for example, in a part of the city can also work to not only mitigate flooding and also cleanse stormwater and help manage water in general, but also help restore biodiversity and have a positive ecological effect, as well as have a positive effect on people and their well-being in their communities.
So what would you say to people then who don't accept the urgency of the situation or think it all just sounds way too expensive?
It's likely to be expensive, but I think it depends on the route we take, and there are less expensive options. But also, I'd really encourage New Zealanders to take a much longer-term view. New Zealand's a relatively, short-lived country, at least in terms of it being called a country as such of New Zealand. Aotearoa stretches further back, but is still relatively unpopulated compared to Europe or even the States, which is also a young country. I think we need to think in terms of centuries rather than decades. And we need to think about those future generations, our children, our children's children, and the planet. It's a selfless kind of act to think that far into the future. But that's really what it's going to take.
Yeah, it's a real mind shift, isn't it? Crystal, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much.